Austin and Poppy, written by Gregory Husby, read by Gregory Husby, and illustrations by Gillian Husby. The weight felt good on his back. The new shoes still fit well, he could tell, as he climbed hoof by hoof up the narrow trail. As he always did, once they had reached the summit, Mr. Johnson pulled the reins left, turned them both around, and took one last look at home. The green grass in the valley, the little house Mr. Johnson had built with the help of Austin. He loved where he lived. Both of them did. Then the reins would gently pull left again, and they were on their way. This was most certainly Austin's favorite day of the month. Texas-bred quarter horses didn't come much handsomer than Austin, and being in fine shape, Mr. Johnson felt particularly light today. Chestnut, with white stockings well above his hocks, and a white blaze down his face, Austin was a fine-looking horse. It also felt good breaking a sweat. Pulling a wagon of lumber or supplies was something Austin had become accustomed to, but this is what he really enjoyed. Just the two of them. Austin always took pride in having Mr. Johnson on his back. This time tomorrow they'd be in Shamrock. That meant the general store, which meant a peppermint stick. Mr. Johnson had always been nice like that to Austin. They were friends. And as always, Austin took care with each drop of his hoof to ensure the balance of his huge frame and the safety of his beloved occupant. The Texas heat can be stifling, and the occasional bones they would pass were vivid reminders that always kept Austin's ears pointed straight up and his eyes wide open. No doubt about it, the trip to Shamrock was fraught with unknown danger. Later, when night fell and Mr. Johnson slept next to the dim light of the campfire, Austin knew that his ears would still be pointed straight up and his eyes would still be wide open. Austin had to be at his keenest for this monthly adventure. There would be little time for sleep. But that was unimportant at the moment. All he could think about as he clippity-clopped along, occasionally wincing from the gusts of dust, was the sweet taste of peppermint that awaited him in Shamrock. There were only 2 freshwater creeks between Wheeler and Shamrock, and with the temperature hovering around 100 or so, Austin and his thirst were looking forward to making the latter of the two as the sun began to drop deep into the west. All afternoon the wind had been kicking up and pushing sagebrush across the trail ahead. Mr. Johnson had watched patiently as the ominous dark clouds crept toward the both of them from the south. He knew that the rain was coming, and that he and his horse needed to find some shelter. The brush, trees, and rolling hills surrounding the both of them for miles and miles offered little. Austin didn't mind the rain at all. It felt good. He did feel sorry for his owner, though. Mr. Johnson always got grumpy and irritable when he got rained on. But for Austin, he was looking forward to 2 things now: getting the saddle off his back to feel the raindrops, and 2, his peppermint stick waiting for him at the general store. The rain had fallen for hours. It fell thick and heavy on his back. Austin was soaked to the bone. He could barely see Mr. Johnson huddled beneath a dried-out old tree, covering himself with his bedding tarp. Off in the distance, the clapping sound of thunder from all sides had been following streaks of light shooting across the sky. This was a storm the likes of which Austin had never seen. Austin did not like to be tied down, and he was glad he wasn't. Back in Wheeler, Mr. Johnson never tied Austin to anything. The large grassy pasture next to the porch, the gentle running creek that he drinks from behind the house, Austin truly wished he were at home right now. The heat seared down his side, and the white light was blinding. Like the sound of a cracking whip, Austin shot sideways, slamming to the ground. Looking up through his dazed eyes, he could see that the tree beneath which he had just been standing was completely split down the middle and now was cascading sparks and flames. Lying in the mud, Austin could feel a deep pain in his side from where he had landed. He was terrified. The pounding in his ears was nearly deafening. Austin got to his four hooves, and his powerful hindquarters bolted him forward. He was fast, and all his mind was telling him was to get away. The darkness and the rain blinded him as the brush ripped across his face, running nearly full speed for what seemed an endless time. His eyes danced back and forth, judging distances of trees and boulders that were but flashes racing by both sides. The rain blurred his vision, and the mud beneath his new horseshoes made footing dangerous at best. Austin's senses had come to life. When Austin finally stopped and turned to look back, his enormous heart was pounding. His breath was rapid and his hocks were shaking. He lowered his head and shook the sweat and rain from his back. Mr. Johnson had been at least 2 trees away from the lightning strike at the camp, and was most certainly safe, but was probably looking for his horse about now. Austin had run about 2 miles from camp. His inherent speed had him now lost, and he was fearful. This was unfamiliar terrain to him. There were other predators about. He had to find Mr. Johnson. As the sun began to rise in the eastern sky, the one thing Austin knew was that Shamrock was in the south. His instincts reminded him of that from his many trips before. The rain had stopped, and if he couldn't find Mr. Johnson or the camp, he would make his way south and look for his owner there. Austin searched and searched for hours. He could find neither. Over each mound of earth he found the same thing, another hill filled with mesquite brush and juniper shrub. He decided it was time to head south. The sun was overhead and the heat blanketed his broad back. All the puddles from the rainstorm had dried up. So off he set in hopes of finding a stream to drink from on his way to Shamrock. Many hours had passed. The sun was sinking low behind Austin as the shadows grew thick. He had to decide if he would travel on through the night or wait until morning to continue. Night travel is dangerous, he thought. Even though Austin was an enormous stallion, he knew he could become prey if not careful. His eyes and ears were on full alert as he walked. Both ears had stopped ringing, and he could now focus in on the slightest rustling through the brush. He would move on until dark, and stand motionless throughout the night until the first beams of morning light. Austin knew it would be a long night as he walked along. It was his right ear that first detected the sound. His nose could immediately smell it. Water. He quickened his pace cautiously. Where there is water, there is the possibility of meeting some not-so-friendly critters that may be thirsty also. This was no time to get ahead of himself. Austin instinctively knew that the running water he could hear and smell was just over the ridge ahead. Now in a slow trot, he could not hide his need for a drink of clear running water. Suddenly, Austin froze to a dead stop. His tight steel shoes edged to the ground in readiness to bolt. The radar in his rigid ears scanned his surroundings to verify what he had thought he had heard. Something that sounded like a wolf. Maybe wolves. Austin knew that he, himself, had not been detected. He could hear the talking continue just up ahead over the ridge. There were 4 wolves, Austin determined, each taking their turns snarling, saying whatever wolves say. The 5th voice he could not make out. As Austin quietly edged forward and raised his head to peek over the ridge and down into the wash, he could see quite clearly what in fact was going on. Down in a gully corner, 4 wolves stood surrounding a very old goat. It was obvious that the goat didn't stand a chance. Austin was big and strong, but knew even he would have problems defending against 4 full-grown pack wolves. The old goat kept turning and defending each move of the wolves, his skinny frame spinning in vain. It looked as though one of his horns had been broken off. Nonetheless, he kept popping his head to and fro, countering each aggressive move. He was in the fight of his life. Austin would have none of this. His large sloped hips lifted him over the edge and landed him squarely behind the 4 growling wolves. Each squealed with high-pitched fear in their voices as the ground shook under Austin's 1,300-pound frame. The goat stood motionless, not so much out of fear, but in amazement at what he was seeing. Austin's eyes pierced from wolf to wolf, seeking out which was the pack leader. Each wolf, in turn, began stalking as if in some pre-rehearsed waltz. Then Austin saw what he needed. 3 of the wolves would regularly glance to the leader, as if seeking guidance. Austin saw this. The wolf leader was still calculating if this large horse could be taken. Then their eyes met, and both knew. The leader wolf lunged forward. Austin spun, kneeling down and summoning every ounce of strength in his body, kicked his powerful hind feet into the air. The whistle of the wind broke as his steel shoes sought their mark. The leader wolf halted in his tracks and began to retreat slowly, his followers in unison. There, in the bottom of a washed-out gulch, somewhere between Wheeler and Shamrock, lost and in a fight for his life, things were not going so well for Austin. He had stumbled into danger while already being in a difficult situation. Even though his predicament had gone from bad to worse, he knew he could not leave this goat that had quietly moved to his side. The wolves stood their ground, aligned, and even angrier that their original prey was now protected. No doubt another horse's odds would not have been as good, but Austin was brave. Deep inside, the wolf leader began to accept the unbearable. This horse was too big and strong for he and his cohorts to risk almost certain injury. They would have to move on and bother someone else in the night. The growls and grumbles ended, and the wolves disappeared into the darkness. "You were in a tough spot," Austin said to the elderly goat. "Glad I was able to help." The old goat began to gingerly move towards the narrow stream for his long-delayed drink. Austin could see that there was a very frayed braid rope wrapped tightly around the goat's gray neck. It looked like it hurt, and his poor neck was noticeably quite red. It had obviously been there for some time. Austin cautiously glanced around to make sure things were safe, lowered his head, and too began drinking the fresh, clear water that briskly and now safely ran through. He said his name was Poppy. His owner was moving from down south up north. Poppy had been tied behind the wagon and had lost his footing. He stumbled, the braid snapped, and the wagon slowly pulled away. A piece of one of his horns had broken off. Poppy did his best to keep up, bellowing out his scream, but soon grew tired and lost sight of his family over the horizon. It's now been a week or so, and he has struggled to merely get by. He had spent his whole life with his family, and now they were gone. Poppy had found a juniper to hide under near the small creek bed, and only came out to drink at night. He would pull off some yucca leaves and eat them in the shade. But Poppy hadn't been so lucky tonight. Those wolves meant business, and he thanked Austin from the bottom of his tired old goat heart for saving him. Austin thought to himself how this poor old goat's life compared to him and his problems. They agreed to both take turns sleeping, standing next to one another until sunlight. Those wolves might come back, and better to stay safe and get rest than travel tired in the night. The next morning, Austin asked Poppy to join him on his journey to Shamrock. Austin knew those wolves would be back, and next time Poppy would not be so lucky. After reassuring Poppy he would be no trouble, The old frail goat agreed, and off they went to the south. Austin explained to Poppy that being on the edge of town was certainly safer than out in the wild. Predators and other critters tend to shy away from noisy towns and humans. He would be safe until he could figure out what he was going to do. It was the best Austin could come up with to make sure old Poppy would come with him. Before they began walking, Austin stepped close to Poppy. He leaned down and with a few grinds of his large teeth bit through the braid around Poppy's neck. It fell to the ground. "There! That's much better," Austin said with relief. Poppy slowly lifted his head up to look at the giant horse. His eyes were full of tears, and he said, "Thank you, Austin. I am happy to have you for a friend." Austin knew he meant it. On they walked and talked for hours. Austin told Poppy of his home, the creek, and the pasture, and how he missed it. Poppy said how he felt bad for his own family. Surely they cried when they realized they had lost their Poppy. Austin was happy he had befriended this hopelessly lost old goat. He walked very slowly so as not to hurry Poppy. All of a sudden, Austin realized where he was. The trail they had forked into looked very familiar. He recognized it as the trail to Shamrock. He began prancing with happiness. Mr. Johnson would have to be there. He could see the rooftops of the buildings and even the livery stables where he had gotten his new shoes the month before. He could see people walking about the town. He could not believe he was finally on the edge of Shamrock. Austin's eyes began to search the faces of each person from a distance, hoping to see Mr. Johnson. He and Poppy began to circle the town, following the edge and looking down the streets as they walked. No, not at the bank, not at the post office, not at the livery. Then he saw him. Austin's happiness was overwhelming. There, at the general store entrance, stood Mr. Johnson, saddle and bags in hand. He looked like a man without a horse. Oh, the joy Austin felt! Austin took one step forward and then remembered Poppy was now standing behind him. It was time to say goodbye. Poppy walked over and brushed his neck to Austin's. He stepped back and offered his thanks again for everything, for saving his life and helping him into town. Poppy smiled and told him to go down to Mr. Johnson. Austin turned and walked towards the general store. His great big heart was heavy, having to leave his new yet old friend. He glanced back and saw that Poppy had sat down to watch him reunite with Mr. Johnson. He would miss old Poppy. Austin began to trot towards the unsuspecting Mr. Johnson standing on the wooden planked walkway. With a full-lunged neigh, Austin announced his arrival. Mr. Johnson stepped off and ran to Austin, hugging his neck and laughing with joy. His horse had found him. When the pets and the hugs had finally stopped, Mr. Johnson pointed his finger into the air and said, "Wait!" With that, he reached into his leather bag and pulled out a full peppermint stick. Oh, joy, Austin thought, as Mr. Johnson reached out to Austin's mouth with the colorful candy. Austin's supple neck turned back to see that Poppy was up, and ever so slowly, walking back into the Badlands. Then Austin's whole muscled body turned. He began to walk back up the edge where Poppy had been, Mr. Johnson following, calling to Austin, still holding out the peppermint with his hand. Poppy heard the commotion and stopped and looked back. Austin walked up to him, Mr. Johnson following behind. There they all stood, the three of them, one confused man, a humble horse, and a lonely old goat. Austin lowered his head and pulled with his lips the peppermint stick from Mr. Johnson's hand. On a large rock between he and Poppy, Austin pressed the sugar stick, cracking it in half. Austin began to bite at his piece. This is what he had been waiting for. The journey was saved. His palate relished the sweet crispness of the mint. Through this joy, Austin stared at Poppy. He then lowered his large horse head, and with his nose nudged the other broken half towards the gray goat. With that, Mr. Johnson said, "It appears you have made a friend on your journey back to me. He is welcome to join us back in Wheeler." Poppy's eyes opened wide. He could not believe it was true. He looked at Austin, whose eyes were now misty, and grinned like old goats do. Then, without delay, Poppy bit into the savory peppermint stick at his feet. Mr. Johnson laughed, Austin neighed, and Poppy had found a home. The journey back to Wheeler was long. Austin made sure the pace was slow, much to Mr. Johnson's chagrin. Poppy settled into his new life, with the field of grass and the creek running through. He was home now. Poppy would never take another trip off the ranch. Each month from then on, upon his return, Austin would always tell Poppy of the journey while they shared a peppermint stick. The end.